Mi darta hirna Dáil nífra cur fuin sin stura in ganifra agus náta grasta brona orin lead of earth concrete. An is gorúsa to so for an little breather agus ar nila ganí fasta agus gur tréit to feet no freed tree creased or dearna. Direct we beseech thee, O Lord, our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every word and work of ours may always begin from thee, and by thee be happily ended through Christ our Lord.
Leaders' questions. I call on Deputy Willie O'Dea on behalf of the floor.
Taoiseach, as you will be aware, yesterday the government published the Mangan report on tax and social welfare, precisely 11 months after having received it. Now, commenting on this report, this morning's Irish Independent quoted a government source as follows, and I quote him exactly, or her, as the case may be. I don't think it's any coincidence that this didn't see the light of day for 11 months. By the time of the next budget, it'll be well buried. After last year, she, meaning Minister Burton, has no intention of revisiting child benefit any time soon, unquote. Now, Taoiseach, I accept that the changes proposed here are so radical that you couldn't do it in one budget. It would take at least 2, perhaps 3. But if you are going to do it, obviously you could start, the logical place to start would be the next budget. So what I want to ask you, on behalf of about 1 million people out there who have more than a passing interest in this, what I want to ask you is this. Does the government favour the recommendations of the majority of the Mangan report, which proposes a 2-tier system? Does the government intend to start implementing the Mangan report, and when do they intend to start? Will they start implementing this report in the next budget, or have they decided to long finger the matter, as has been suggested in various media outlets this morning?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Well, the whole area of support for children and families is a hugely important one. The state is currently spending, when everything is taken into account, child benefit and child support payments and so on, it's about €2.8 billion. As I think everybody is aware, there has been a debate going on in public for some time about what is the best way in which that money should be directed and should be spent. The Minister for Social Protection commissioned the report which was published yesterday, the Mangan report. She has been engaged in discussions with other government departments about the Mangan report and how it should be addressed. The intention now is that the Minister for Social Protection will bring that report to the Oireachtas committee. There will be a full opportunity to have a debate and a discussion on it. I'm sure if the Deputy wishes, there can be a full debate here in the House on it. The Minister for Social Protection is very anxious that there would be a full discussion and that the opinions of all political parties and interest groups and those who are interested in this issue would be aired and would be addressed. The government has not taken any decision in relation to the contents of the report. I think that would be to prejudge the discussion that will take place at the Oireachtas committee and here in the House and in the wider public about the contents of the report.
Thank you. Deputy O'Dea.
Well, I thank the Taoiseach for his clarification. I mean, I think that the parents of Middle Ireland who are extremely worried about the contents of this report can breathe a little easier now, because I take it from the Taoiseach's reply that there's no immediate intention to implement the report anyway. You haven't made any decision on the matter yet. Isn't that what you said? You've taken no decision. You've taken no decision on whether or not you support the recommendations in the report. You've taken absolutely no decision on it. Can I further put it to the Taoiseach that the report itself states that the impact of a 2-tier system on poverty would be marginal, and goes on to concede that the people who would be hardest hit would be income earners in Middle Ireland. It also concedes that the effects on employment incentives would be mixed at best. So can I suggest to the Taoiseach that, it's hardly worth the political trouble and has hardly worked the social dislocation of hitting Middle Ireland to squeeze middle once more to bring about results which the proposals of the report concede are at best marginal.
Thank you, Deputy.
Well, I think that Deputy O'Dea's question, I think, very clearly demonstrates the value of the approach that the Government and the Minister for Social Protection is taking on this issue, that this is an issue that does need a broad discussion. And it contrasts, indeed, with the approach that your own party in government took on this issue, because in the National Recovery Plan that you published in 2010, you talked about the development of a rebalanced and integrated child income support payment system, which would provide for a universal component to replace child benefit with one single payment rate per child. This payment will be supplemented with a further payment in the case of children of families in receipt of a social welfare payment or in low-income employment. That was settled. That was your government. That was your government.
Please.
That was your. That was Deputy O'Dea. Deputy O'Dea. That was your government's settled policy in 2010, which you included in the National Recovery Plan. Now, the approach which Minister Burton is taking is a manifest improvement on that. That we have the report of an expert group which addresses the entire issue of child support in its widest sense. We will have a full discussion on it. There will be plenty of time for people to discuss it at the committee, discuss it in here if you need to have it. And I'm sure that Minister Burton would be very happy to take on board suggestions and proposals which will come from you, Deputy O'Dea, or from other members of the House.
Thank you very much. Deputy Pearse Doherty on behalf of Sinn Féin. Thank you.
This week, the CEO of AIB announced that further mortgage interest rate hikes were on the way. And as you know, for every %1% rise in rates, it adds €30 a month to the cost of repayments for every €200,000 borrowed. And this will affect 70,000 AIB variable mortgage interest rate customers directly. And it's a move that is likely to be followed by other banks, as we've seen in the trend in recent times. And there's no doubt about it that this move will push further people into mortgage arrears. Taoiseach, you know that this bank is a state bank. The Irish people own 99.8% of this bank, and it has received €21 billion in taxpayers' money. So, Taoiseach, the question is, what is your government going to do about this? What has happened to the Labour Party's commitment to help homeowners weather the recession? Taoiseach, 2 years ago, yesterday, you launched on behalf of the Labour Party your plan for distressed mortgages and household debt. This document here. 2 years ago, you told families that if Labour was in government, that they would enjoy peace of mind. You said that banks had already received hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money, and that there needed to be a quid pro quo for those in mortgage distress, that they would be given a breather. So, Taoiseach, what has happened to those promises? Since then, more billions have been given to the banks. Since then, mortgage distress, those in mortgage distress have doubled. Since then, the Master of the High Court has claimed that those in mortgage distress struggling were being forced into suicide. And since then, as we know, there are now 180,000 families standing in mortgage distress. That's 1 in every 4 mortgage holder. So, Taoiseach, where is the breather that you promised these families? Where is the peace of mind that you promised these families?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, since then, we have gone on to implement what was in that document. We have brought forward legislation to establish on personal insolvency and to establish a personal insolvency service. The Minister for Housing has brought forward proposals in relation to buy-to-rent and a range of measures to support people who are in mortgage distress. I have to say that we are not happy with the response of the banks. We've put in place personal insolvency legislation, establishing personal insolvency service. The personal insolvency legislation sets out a framework by which banks are required to reach settlements with those who have mortgage difficulties. The Governor of the Central Bank has already spoken about this and has already indicated his unhappiness at the speed and urgency with which the banks are taking on the issue of mortgage distress. And I want to say to you and to the House and to anybody else who has an interest in this, that this is an issue that the Government will continue to pursue and to address. The difficulties that householders face in paying their mortgage, the difficulties that they have in respect of their dealings with the banks is going to have to be addressed. We've put in place legislation, putting in place the Personal Insolvency Service, putting in place a range of supports for people who are in mortgage distress, and they are going to have to be implemented.
Thank you. Deputy Doherty.
Taoiseach, can you genuinely claim that after 2 years of your party in government that you've provided any peace of mind or any breathing space for those in mortgage distress? I think that's a claim that you can't make despite being 2 years in office. You talk about the personal insolvency bill, but you retain the veto with the banks. So again, it is the banks that have the final say. You talk about the mortgage to rent scheme, piloted a year ago, rolled out across the state 8 months ago, and 8 applications have been processed. Is this Labour's claim of how they're dealing with this? 180,000 people in mortgage distress, yet your mortgage to rent scheme processes only 8 applications. Minister, the reality is that the banks are treating the public with contempt. And we know last October that Fiona Muldoon, the head of the banking regulation of the Irish Central Bank, was scathing in her criticism of the bankers and their failure to address the issue.
Thank you.
And the government has done nothing. And the question is, the only meaningful thing that you've done is heap more charges on those that are in mortgage distress through the family home tax. So, Taoiseach, what is the government going to do that if, in relation to the 70,000 people that are on variable interest rates with AIB, what are you going to do to give them peace of mind or breathing space? Are you going to call in the banks? Are you going to tell the CEO of that bank, which we own, that it is unacceptable to raise mortgage interest rates at this point in time? We're in the middle of the biggest mortgage crisis that this state has ever faced.
Thank you.
Is this government going to stand up? Are you going to give them a breathing space? Are you going to allow people some peace of mind until this issue is resolved?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, the cornerstone of the government's policy is to enable people to continue to live in their own home. The biggest fear that anybody has is that they'll lose their home. That's the biggest fear, the biggest concern that they have. And the approach that the government has taken to the mortgage crisis has been to ensure that people are able to live in their own home. And that is why we brought in legislation for the first time ever in this state, personal insolvency legislation, which puts in place a range of ways in which settlements and agreements can be made between householders and their banks and their lending agencies to deal with their mortgage arrears problem. And secondly, put in place a range of supports which will provide that peace of mind to people that no matter what happens, where people are making the effort to pay their mortgage or where they find themselves in situations that they can't pay for a variety of difficulties that have arisen, that they're not going to lose the roof over their head. Now, there are some... Look, we talk to the banks all of the time, Deputy. This is the first...
Sorry, please.
This is the first. No, sorry.
Please. Let us finish the reply.
This is the first government. This is the first government that has had a serious engagement with the banks about how they deal with mortgage arrears. Now, I have said very frankly, that we are not satisfied. We are not satisfied with the speed and the urgency with which the banks are dealing with the mortgage issue. And you may be in no doubt but that we will deal with that issue effectively with the banks. That is the approach that we're taking. That approach is being effective. That is the approach which is in the interests of the people who are in mortgage distress. They're the people. Hold on.
Thank you.
They're the people that we need. No,
Sorry, the time is up now, please.
your only interest in this is to have, is to score a political hit on it. And that was the approach. That was the approach.
Sorry, we're over time.
That's the approach. You come in here, and you have more to say.
Sorry, please. This is leaders.
You have more to say about other political parties and scoring points over other political parties than you do supporting the people who are in need and who are in mortgage distress. This government has acted on the issue of mortgages. This government has legislated on it. This government is the government that will stand by people who are in mortgage distress.
Thank you. Deputy Boyd Barrett, I call. Thank you.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, your government has claimed repeatedly that you're legally prevented from cutting the obscene pensions of former politicians and top civil servants. Yet, as we speak, you are moving to tear up an agreement that was made with public sector workers that was supposed to run until the middle of 2014, and are demanding further drastic cuts in pay and conditions for public sector workers who have already been hammered with cuts in their pay and conditions over the last 4 years. Can I remind you, Taoiseach, that even before Croke Park, public sector workers lost between 15 and 20% of their pay in levies, cuts and the universal social charge. Under Croke Park, public sector workers have given back €1.5 billion in savings through redeployment, linking increments to performance, changing shift patterns, reducing the pay of new entrants by 10 to 20%, by cutting pensions to career average, by increasing retirement age to 68, by reducing numbers originally supposed to be reduced by 18,000, now up to 35,000, and by endless other cuts in pay, conditions and allowances. Now, on top of that, you want another $1 billion in cuts. Do you realise that the proposed cuts in premiums and allowance will mean an approximate 10% cut in pay for nurses, firefighters, guards and other public servants? Do you realise that the additional 5 hours work per week you are proposing for public servants is an effective pay cut of 12.8%? Do you not understand that tens of thousands of these public sector workers are among the 180,000 people who cannot pay their mortgages and who are now to be hit with €1,000 extra in interest payments per year, home taxes and water charges?
Please. Thank you.
So can I ask you, Taoiseach, as leader of the Labour Party, on the 100th anniversary of the 1913 lockout, is it not a monstrous betrayal by the Labour Party of the traditions of that party and its founder, James Connolly, to be asking further pay cuts of nurses whose take-home pay is about €25,000 per year, or newly qualified teachers whose take-home pay is €21,000 per year? And those demands being made by ministers who are on €140,000 a year. Would James Connolly not be spinning in his grave at what you're trying to do to these workers?
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Well, Deputy Boyd Barrett did describe the way in which the previous government came in here with legislation and unilaterally cut the pay of people who work in our public services. This government respects the people who work in our public services, the Gardaí, the nurses, the people who work in our hospitals, people who work in our schools, the people who go out and who work on our roads, clear the drains. These are the people that we respect, and that is why the approach that this government has taken is to sit down with their representatives and to negotiate the requirement to reduce the pay bill by €1 billion. That's the requirement. And that reduction is something that will be negotiated with the representatives of the people who work in our public services. When that process of negotiation is completed, their representatives, their unions, will put the outcome of the discussions to a ballot of their members, who will then decide democratically whether they want to accept it or not. That is the approach that is the right approach to take. It's one that respects the people who work in our public services. It is the most sensible way of dealing with it. It is dealing with it by way of negotiation and discussion. The place for those negotiations and discussion to take place is at the negotiating table, not by megaphone, not in here in this chamber, around the table with the representatives of the people who work in our public services. Those discussions are underway, and I think out of respect for the people who work in our public services, I think that everybody in this House should allow that process of negotiations to continue, to conclude, and then let the outcome be put to the members by way of ballot.
Thank you. Deputy Boyd-Barrett, 1 minute. Thank you.
I don't agree. That's democracy, huh?
How can you seriously talk about respect when ministers who are earning €140,000 a year, several multiples of what teachers or nurses or firefighters are earning, are asking those workers to take even further cuts in pay and conditions? Workers who can barely make their mortgage payments, who can barely pay their bills. How are they supposed to? How are they supposed to pay their mortgages? Those who are already in mortgage distress and in arrears. How are they supposed to pay the home tax you now want to impose on them?
Question, please.
And do you not understand the subjunctive? How? I asked them, how are they supposed to pay? How are they supposed to pay their mortgages and their bills or the home taxes? And
You're now over time, Deputy. Would you please resume your seat? Thank you. Resume your seat. Thank you.
what makes you think it's justified to ask these workers to pay another billion?
Resume your seat. You're over time. Thank you.
Have you cut across me, Kilcourt?
Excuse me. It's my duty to remind you that this is leaders' questions, not statements.
It was a question. Excuse me, Kilcourt.
Resume your seat.
On a point of order, it was a question.
Resume your seat, I said.
Kilcourt,
Resume your seat.
it's a question.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat.
You said it wasn't a question. It was a question.
Resume your seat.
I asked the Taoiseach.
Resume your seat, will you?
How could people be expected?
Will you please resume your seat?
Could you answer the question? Which was a question.
Deputy Boyd-Barrett, all over this country, individual people who work in our public services, whether teachers in schools or people who work in our hospitals or local authorities or any area of our public services, voluntarily join a trade union. They elect their trade union leaders. Those trade unions sit down with government to negotiate pay agreements, conditions of employment, how the interface between management and employee operates in practice. That's what this government believes in. We believe in sitting down, negotiating with the representatives of the people who work in our... No, please. The only thing we can be sure of, those discussions are underway. And there's no point anybody here in this House trying to second-guess what is going on in the negotiations or trying to predict the outcome. The only thing that we can be sure of, Deputy Boyd-Barrett, the only thing we can be sure of about the outcome of those negotiations is whenever they are concluded, you will accuse, as you always do, the representatives of their employees of selling them out.
Thank you. That completes leaders' questions for today. We now move on to the order of business.
2013 lockdown. 2013 sellout.
Comhairle, the order of business shall be as follows. Number 6, Finance Bill 2013, second stage resumed. Number 7, Motor Vehicle Duties and Licences Bill 2013, order for second stage and second stage to adjourn at 7 p.m. tonight, if not previously concluded. It is proposed, notwithstanding anything in standing orders, that the Dáil shall sit later than 5:45 p.m. tonight and shall adjourn on the conclusion of oral questions. The sitting shall be suspended on the conclusion of number 6 for 30 minutes. The resumed stage of number 6 shall, if not previously concluded, be brought to a conclusion at 2:30 p.m. Number 3, topical issues will be taken on the conclusion of number 7 or at 7 p.m, whichever is the earlier, and the order shall resume thereafter with oral questions.
Thank you. There are 3 proposals to be put to the House. Number 1 is the proposal that the Dáil should sit later than 5:45 tonight and the suspension of sitting agreed to. That agreed? Number 2 is the proposal for dealing with item number 6, second stage of the Finance Bill 2013 agreed to. Not agreed.
This is a continuous trend of this government to impose the guillotine, and I've said this on numerous times in relation to other pieces of legislation, that there has been debate, and this will be the 3rd day of debate in terms of the finance bill. But this finance bill contains serious measures that will impact on people the length and breadth of this state, including additional hardship on many of our citizens who are struggling under a weight of debt. There is no need for this guillotine. I believe that this debate could conclude without a guillotine being imposed, but people on both sides of this chamber should be afforded the opportunity to have their say in relation to the finance bill. We oppose the guillotine of this.
Thank you. Tánaiste to reply.
Well, by the time we reach 2:30 today, there will already have been 12 hours of debate on the finance bill. It's a bill which is giving effect to the measures in the budget on which there was previously a debate in the House. We feel that the time that is provided is adequate, and as I think the House is aware, there is a requirement that the finance bill is passed within a certain period of time after the budget.
Thank you. I now put the question. The question is that the proposal for dealing with item number 6, second stage of Finance Bill 2013 be agreed to. The teachtaí atá héamh na tuairiscine abrís tá, the teachtaí atá na cinenne abrís níl. Sílim Gwyn and Kestrich. Proposal is agreed. Is the proposal for dealing with topical issues agreed to? Agreed. On the order of business, Deputy O'Day.
Just in asking about promised legislation, Tánaiste, can I just take the opportunity? Can I take the opportunity to congratulate the Gardaí in Limerick for the tenacity with which they are still pursuing the murder case of Roy Collins? We'll start in a minute.
Sorry, if you wouldn't mind, just allow the deputy. Okay. I'll take deputies after I take the representatives. So please, no, please just put down your hands for a moment, and we'll deal with the main spokesperson.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Comhairle. In asking on a question on promised legislation, can I take this opportunity to congratulate the Gardaí in Limerick for the tenacity with which they are still pursuing the murder of Roy Collins, who, as you know, was murdered in a particularly callous and brutal manner 4 years ago. In that regard, Tánaiste, can I ask you, there's a piece of legislation on the criminal justice section called the Criminal Justice Proceeds of Crime Bill. 2 things I want to ask you about that. When do you expect to publish that legislation? And secondly, does the government intend to use the occasion of that legislation to strengthen the anti-gangland provisions that are there already? Because the Gardaí have made it known that there are a number of weaknesses that have emerged in that legislation, a number of loopholes that would need to be closed off.
Thank you. Tánaiste.
Well, first of all, I want to join with Deputy O'Day in congratulating the Gardaí in Limerick on the work that they have been doing and the success of that work. I think that is something I think that we all share. The Criminal Justice Proceeds of Crime Bill is a bill to strengthen the powers of the Criminal Assets Bureau in relation to forfeiting the proceeds of crime. There are consultations which are taking place with the Criminal Assets Bureau at present about that piece of legislation. It isn't possible to give a precise date for publication of the bill because the consultations with the CAB are continuing. But the intention is that once those consultations are completed, to proceed with the legislation.
Deputy Dáil.
Corley, on two issues of pending legislation. Taoiseach, I want to raise with you the proposals for the handling of the Finance Local Property Tax Bill. This bill is going to be rushed through this Dáil again. We've already seen this is an amendment bill. The original bill was rushed through during committee stage of the last bill. We only got to one motion that could be voted on. All other motions fell. So the proposal is that we deal with the second stage next Friday and a guillotine imposed, and then all remaining stage the following Tuesday. And it's clear from the note that's been provided to the whips is that this is to facilitate a bulk mail-out by the Revenue Commissioners telling people how much money that they have to pay in relation to this new tax on the 9th of March. Taoiseach, I think this is completely unacceptable. This is the chamber that decides how we order business, not the Revenue Commissioners. We do not dance to anybody else's tune. We should have appropriate time to consider the implications of this amendment bill. We should have time to discuss all of the amendments that will be put forward by our party and other members of this Dáil. And I would ask you to reconsider the timing and the scheduling of this legislation to allow appropriate time. On a second issue, Taoiseach, there was agreement reached in Brussels yesterday in relation to the two-pack, and this allows for greater surveillance by European institutions of budgets in Ireland and other member states. Can you confirm, Taoiseach, that this agreement will mean that Ireland will continue to be under the scrutiny of the ECB and the European Commission even after we leave the bailout mechanism? And can you confirm that the budget will be moved now to October, close to the 15th of October, as a result of the agreement? And will legislation be required to implement the agreement that was reached in Brussels?
Taoiseach.
Well, first of all, on the property tax amendment bill, that is to provide for a number of improvements to the legislation as it stands. Many of those improvements I would have thought that the Deputy would be in favour of, like, for example, the exemption for the pyrite homes, like the arrangements that are being proposed for social housing, whether it's local authority housing or the voluntary housing associations. And I'm surprised to hear the Deputy wanting to block those improvements in the.
If you give original time, you make me rushing through an amendment to the bill a couple of months later.
Thank you. Well, this is a government that wants to improve the legislation that we have, and it is scheduled. It is scheduled to be debated here in the House on Friday. And I think that's a reasonable arrangement. In relation to the agreement that was reached yesterday, that agreement will now have to be considered by member states. The government will consider that agreement. No decision has been made in relation to the date of the budget.
Thank you, Deputy Tobin.
It's over 2.5 years since the construction contracts bill was introduced to the Oireachtas, Taoiseach, and we've been waiting 9 months for the legislation to reach committee stage. It's a very important piece of legislation, and I think most of the parties around the House would actually support the main thrusts of it. It seems to be that the Cabinet is a logjam with regards to new amendments. When will this piece of legislation get through Cabinet and make it to the committee stage? And there's just a second point, if I can. The local enterprise organisations which are planned to replace the county enterprise boards this year, just want to find out, when is that legislation going to happen? It means the destruction of the county enterprise boards in the form that they're in, and this is against the wishes of the stakeholders in enterprise, including SFA and ISME.
First of all, the construction contracts bill, that bill is due to be in committee early in March. The bill in relation to the local development boards is due this session.
Thank you. Deputy Durkin.
Thank you, Can Corla. 2 items of promised legislation. The landlord and tenant bill, which was promised for 2014. But I ask if, perhaps, in view of the changing situation in relation to tenancies and housing accommodation generally, would it be possible to bring the bill forward at an earlier date.
Thank you.
And bring about its publication. Similarly, in relation to the Children's Amendment Bill, has that bill been prepared? Has the head been prepared for read? And when is it likely to happen?
The Children's Amendment Bill will be this year, and the Landlord and Tenant Bill is intended to be early next year.
Thank you, Deputy O'Farrell.
In the context of the Children First Bill, which is on the A list, my question is posed. In responding to a topical issue last week on the question of inter-country adoption, Minister of State Joe Costello said the prospective adoptive parents should, to the extent possible, pay for all expenses involved in the adoption through the accredited body. Will this piece of promised legislation, Children First, address this issue of inter-country adoption and the costs involved? Because what is being said by Minister Costello seems to suggest, but it does seem to suggest, Count Corla, that adoptions will only be possible on an inter-country basis.
I'd say a parliamentary question
who are very well off and who can afford the entirety of the costs involved.
Is the bill coming in?
Yeah, the Children First Bill, there's ongoing consideration of the views of the Oireachtas Committee, including significant policy, operational and legal issues, and it's intended to be published this session.
Thank you. Deputy Humphreys.
Taoiseach, August of last year, of 2012, the Hussein versus the Labour Court judgment highlighted serious loopholes in the Employment Permit Bill and the Workplace Relation Bill. Is there proposals for amendments to come to that bill shortly?
Yeah. Yes, there are proposals in respect to both of those pieces of legislation, and both of them are expected this session.
Thank you. Deputy McGrath.
I want to ask, and I know Deputy asked already, about county enterprise boards in relation to the leader development companies. That there been also legislation coming forward to take them in under the county council. I think this is a retrograde step, and I want to know when the legislation is coming forward. And also on the water services bill. Does the Minister know, I know the Minister of Environment is not here, that this whole thing is in a pure shambles? The EPA and the local authorities have no capacity.
That when the bill is in.
Yes, sorry?
You can discuss that when the bill is before.
Yes, but it's becoming a bigger mess every day because the EPA are now trying to source places for people to dispose of sludge. Local authorities can't take it.
Water services bill?
Yeah, I understand that bill will be at committee next week.
At committee next week, Deputy. Deputy, sorry, your first bill was?
It's in relation to the environment.
As I understand, there's no legislation in relation to the leader companies.
Deputy Healy-Rae.
Could I ask the Taoiseach to please, yesterday there was a very informative session with regard to climate change, and what are the government's proposals with regard to the climate bill, and when is it coming before the House?
Climate change bill, thank you.
The climate change bill is before government, and it's expected to be approved and published shortly.
Thank you. Deputy Bannon.
In the interest of every aspect of transparency, can the Taoiseach tell me when the regulation of lobbying bill is to be published, as this is very much in keeping with the reform, political reform? And also the second, as everyone knows, one of the finest sports centres was opened in the Midlands last weekend. Can the Taoiseach update me as when the sports bill will be introduced for the amalgamation and regulation of sport facilities, and he can assure me that this will improve for sporting facilities throughout the length and breadth of Ireland.
Two pieces of legislation.
The registration of lobbying bill work has commenced on drafting the heads of that bill, and it's expected to be published this year, and the sports bill is also expected to be published this year.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Cowan.
Thank you, Count Corley. Yes, Taoiseach, in relation to children and youth affairs, three bills coming before this session, I believe, that being the Child and Family Support Agency Bill, the Childcare Amendment Bill, the Children First Bill. And it's obvious then that the Mangan report will have no part to play in any of those bills. If that be the case, in relation to Deputy O'Dee's first question, surely by inference that report will be shelved.
The Child and Family Support Agency Bill, that's expected to be published this session. I've already referred to the Children First Bill, that's also to be published this session. And the third bill, Deputy Cowan, was?
Childcare Amendment Bill.
Oh, the Childcare Amendment Bill. Yeah, that's
Mangan report.
That's also to be published this session, and I'm sure that the discussions that will be held at the Oireachtas committee on the Mangan report will inform the way in which the House addresses those bills.
Deputy O'Snoddy.
Good, Count Corla. Two pieces of legislation. One, it was announced in the budget that the digital hub in Dublin would be transferred to the control of Dublin City Council. There's no piece of legislation on the legislative programme to indicate when or how that would happen, and I was wondering, could you indicate what piece of legislation it would be, or is it a separate piece of legislation that's forthcoming, given that this is a highly successful area of development in the city? And the second piece of legislation is one that's also for publication this session, the Protected Disclosure in the Public Interest Bill, which was to provide for protection against reprisal and victimisation and redress for workers who disclose information regarding serious wrongdoing in the workplace. And is that forthcoming?
Two pieces of legislation.
Yes. The Protected Disclosure in the Public Interest Bill, the heads of that bill have been approved by government, and it's expected to be published this session. In relation to the arrangements for the digital hub, I understand that Minister Rabbitte has replied to Deputy O'Snoddy in relation to that matter, and I'm just looking at this. It's quite a detailed reply. I don't propose to read it out, but I'm sure if there's any issue arising from
the promised legislation.
No, it's there's an explanation here, which arising from a similar question that Deputy O'Snoddy raised here with Minister Rabbitte on a previous occasion, and Minister Rabbitte has responded directly to Deputy O'Snoddy about
no legislation promised at the moment. Deputy Griffin.
Just want to ask in relation to the Criminal Justice Legal Aid Bill, when will that be brought forward, and if there will be focus in that bill on reducing costs associated with legal aid, and if there will also be focus in that bill on preventing abuse of the system.
We'll check out when it's due.
Yeah. The Criminal Justice Legal Aid Bill is expected late this year.
Thank you. Deputy McLaughlin.
Tarnished a number of bills here. The Legal Services Regulation Bill, when do you anticipate that will be back before the House? The Mental Capacity Bill, when will that be back before the House or advanced? And then finally, the Spent Convictions Bill, when will that be coming for committee stage?
Spent convictions. Yeah. Yeah, the first bill that you mentioned, Deputy McLaughlin, that bill is at committee. The second bill, the Mental Capacity Bill, this is expected this session, and the Spent Convictions Bill is awaiting second stage debate.
Thank you, Deputy Butler.
Thank you, Taoiseach, could you tell me when the Minerals Development Bill is going to be published? It's to modernise and consolidate all mineral development legislation. We now look at the Tara mine situation and we see what's going on, and really we do need good legislation on giving new licences out to companies.
Thank you, Deputy.
The Mineral Development Bill is expected this session.
This session, Deputy. That completes the order of business for today. We now move on to Private Members Bill, Public Holidays Bill 2013, first stage. I'd like to call on Deputy Angus O'Snoddy to move for leave to introduce the bill.
I seek leave to move the bill.
The bill being opposed? Not opposed. Not opposed. I declare the motion for leave to introduce agreed. So this is a Private Members Bill. Perhaps the Deputy would move that the second stage be taken in private members.
I move.
Thank you. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Private Members Bill, Employment Equality Amendment Bill, first stage. I call on Deputy Jonathan O'Brien to move for leave to introduce the bill.
I seek leave.
Is the bill being opposed?
Not opposed.
Not opposed. I declare the motion for leave to introduce agreed. Since this is a Private Members Bill, second stage must be taken in private members' time. Let's ask the Deputy to move that the second stage be taken in private.
I move, Count Corla.
Is that agreed? Agreed. We now move back to the finance bill. Deputy McLennan is in possession, sharing time with Deputy Jonathan O'Brien, who has 8 minutes, and Deputy Queeveen O'Quailon has 5 minutes. Have you spoken yet, Deputy? No, you're just beginning now.
No, I have used up about 2 minutes, I think.
Yeah, you're resuming. I think you've about 5 minutes left.
In a time of fiscal austerity, cutbacks, mass unemployment and national despondency, the arts offer a valuable and creative outlet for people. In a mature society that values expression and creativity, the arts have the potential to enrich lives. They help us to think about the world and our place in it in a more imaginative, innovative and abstract way. Sinn Féin yet again calls on the Minister to respect and adhere to the arm's length principle and to meet with the National Campaign for the Arts and other representative organisations. We would urge Minister Deenihan to recognise that cuts to our key cultural institutions have the potential to cause long-term and irreparable damage to the National Archives and to the nation's collective history. For example, the National Library, which is primarily responsible for the processing and preserving of publications and historic documentary material, has yet again seen its budget cut. This is in spite of the fact that since 2008, this key national institution has suffered a decline in purchasing power of 85% and seen its overall budget cut by 44% in the same period. As we begin the decade of commemoration, it is imperative that we have independent, robust and well-funded national artistic and cultural institutions. Only then can the various commemorations be seen as an opportunity to revisit our past with the aim of building a more equal and caring society. Sinn Féin calls on the Minister to develop an all-Ireland approach to arts and culture, and we would urge him to remember that sometimes there are very rare institutions whose societal value far exceeds any monetary value. When we come to heritage, proposed plans by the Government to sell off Cuilta harvesting rights would have a direct negative impact on 11 forest parks and on more than 150 recreation sites. For more than 50 years, the use of the publicly owned Cuilta estate by the people of Ireland has been made possible by the open access policy. Privatisation would undoubtedly bring an end to this, and it would also have a serious impact on tourism, both domestic and international. More importantly, according to the Bacon report, no argument has been formulated to support the economic rationale for the sale. When it comes to sport, we are in a situation where clubs, sporting organisations and community groups who were not successful in the recent allocation of grants under the Sports Capital programme will now have to wait until 2015 before they can apply again. This is an appalling situation, and as with everything else, its effects are felt more deeply in working class areas where sport is vitally important for young people. The cuts outlined above are the result of poorly thought out policy decisions that will have a negative impact on our country and on our people. For example, Sinn Féin is deeply concerned by the proposal to merge the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the Crawford Art Gallery and the National Gallery of Ireland. We are also opposed to the proposed merger of the National Archives and the Irish Manuscript Commission, and to any change in the arm's length principle, or to any proposals that would interfere with the independence of key artistic and cultural institutions. The Government has not produced any information regarding cost-benefit analysis, headcount reductions, etc., that would justify the proposed changes, yet is hell-bent on embarking on a process of amalgamations, mergers, dissolution of independent boards and non-renewal of vital leadership roles. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
I now call on Deputy Jonathan O'Brien.
Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle. I've been listening to the debate for most of the day yesterday on the monitor in my office, and I think it was clear that many of the deputies on the government side believe that many of the measures contained within this finance bill will help get people back to work, will help stimulate the economy, will help particularly around the construction sector, where there was a number of measures announced which the government feel would certainly stimulate that section of the labour force, and how that stimulation will help reinvigorate local economies, It talked about the extension to the employment incentive scheme. And while there are some good elements in it, it won't come as a surprise, Minister, I'm sure, that we don't believe that the measures contained within this finance bill is actually going to stimulate the economy. It's not going to get people back to work. And many of the measures really fall very far short of what's needed. But I think, despite those differences, one of the things that I'm sure all deputies in this House will agree on is the role that education can play in getting back economic sovereignty, and the role that education will play in making sure that we have a highly skilled and adaptable workforce to meet the challenges over the next number of years. It's a well-known fact that a well-funded education system is necessary if we are to make that transition from recession back into a situation where we have economic recovery. We also know that investing in education from the early years right through to higher education creates the type of workforce that can change and adapt to the labour conditions out there. So in other words, when we enter recession, we have a very adaptable workforce. We have in place the training programmes, the further education systems that are needed to meet the changing demand that industry puts on us. And I think if we look at some of the recent reports which have been published, we can measure how well we're actually achieving that. The 2010 Education at a Glance report looked at what countries were spending on education, and it also looked at how different education systems operated in different member states. It emphasised the importance of education, not just to the individuals, but to the society in general. And it showed that a well-funded education system allows people to reach their potential and therefore allows societies better deal with recession, as I said previously. And while the report, didn't state anything that was obvious to us, we all know well-funded education is essential. It did highlight a number of factors in relation to Ireland's performance in the area of education and higher learning. For example, it found that education spending in this state was the 4th lowest among the 31 OECD countries. Roughly around 4.7% of GDP was spent on education. Now, that investment, or that low level of investment in education, has resulted in our schools being underfunded. It has resulted in many of our universities struggling. It has resulted in above average class sizes, and it also resulted in a downturn in literacy and numeracy levels. Now, I know the report data in that particular report, even though it was published in 2010, was actually collected in 2007, just as the so-called Celtic Tiger was coming to an end. And since then, we've had 6 more austerity budgets which have diminished the spending on education even further. So the way that this government is seeking to deal with the economic crisis and the resulting economic hardship it is imposing on our citizens is to impose even harsher austerity and cutbacks in social spending, which strike hardest at the most vulnerable in society, and it also deepens social inequalities. So not only are you failing to stimulate the Irish economy, you're also entrenching the type of policies which actually further deepen the recession, in my opinion. Now, in our pre-budget submission, Minister, I'm not sure whether you read it or not, but if you didn't, maybe you should take a glance at it, because we did put forward a number of proposals that were underpinned by very progressive taxation measures, which would, if implemented, would have allowed us, if we were in government, to ring-fence the education budget this year. We would have no cuts in the education budget. Not only in the education budget, but also in other priority departments which are needed to stimulate the economy. And we did this because international best evidence has proven that ring-fencing, and in most cases where possible, even in times of recession, increasing your education budgets is the way to go. If you look at the system that was brought in Finland, where its economy and the collapse of the old Soviet Union was in recession, and they responded to that recession by prioritising spending on education. Not only did they prioritise it and ring-fence the budgets of education, they actually increased it. They invested in their education system, and they are now seen as one of the more progressive education systems in the world. They have a very solid economy. They have a very well-funded, progressive measures which nurtured learning from a very, very early age and carried through that learning process right up to higher education. They have a very adaptable workforce. They have a very highly educated, skilled workforce which can meet the challenging demands such as the recession and economic crisis which has beset Europe. And it's not just confined to Finland. I mean, places like Norway and Sweden adopted very similar measures when it came to education, and it's something that we need to do. If you look much closer to home, because some people will say that the Nordic model wouldn't suit this particular state, but if you look even just up the road in the 6 counties, the findings of a study of primary school pupils in the 6 counties recently showed that they are performing better in reading and writing than in any other English-speaking country in the world. The 6-county education system, best performance in reading and writing of any other English-speaking country in the world. Now, that is a remarkable achievement considering the constraints that are imposed on the executive up there in terms of its finances and the receipt of a block grant. But the Minister for Education up there, who is a Sinn Féin Minister for Education, in association with the executive and a cross-party support, prioritised spending on education. Not only have they prioritised it, but despite getting reduction in block grants, they have decided to increase spending on education within the 6 counties, and they are now reaping the benefits of it, as that report has showed. 2 other studies verified the performance of the education sector within the 6 counties. The first was known as the TIMS report, Trends in International Maths and Science Study, and the second is the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. And they have shown that the increased investment since